What did we learn from the Singapore Grand Prix? That's what we'll be taking a look at with data analysis of the race, comparing tyre wear and race pace, seeing how Russell clinched a pretty marginal victory, and also looking deeper into the data of Max Verstappen's struggles and Hamilton's brake failure. So first of all, here's your race pace. Your top four are Russell, Piastri, Hamilton and Verstappen, and there's a few surprising bits in there, so let's take a quick look. Hamilton's up there so high because his laps after he had that brake failure aren't included, and also because we can see he had that extra soft stint at the end, so he did an extra pit stop but had more fresh tyres than the other guys. Also, Piastri being higher than Norris. Why is that? Well, Piastri on average was quicker. The fact that he ended up behind was more to do with his pit stop and of course also track position, which is incredibly important after Lando made that move on lap 1. Interestingly also is Verstappen over here, only 0.075 off of Russell's pace. It is incredibly tight. Piastri only half of that. It really is a much tighter race than what it initially seemed, perhaps from the gap that Russell pulled out at the beginning, although that's really because he had the right pace at the right time, which we'll see when we look at tyre wear. So Hamilton's real pace should really be in line with Leclerc out here, about half a second off the pace. Antonelli, interestingly, 0.4 off Russell, which is similar to what we've seen at some other Grand Prix. Of course, he did have more traffic. Looking back, something impressive was Sainz and Albon. Sainz did a really long medium stint and just about managed to get into the points. And another interesting comparison here, we've got Alonso and Stroll. If I isolate that, we can see that Stroll is actually nearly a whole second off Alonso's pace. So now to move on to the consistency of each driver during the race. These are the standard deviations of their lap times, meaning lower is better, showing that Sainz was actually the most consistent driver, followed then by Colapinto and Russell. Interestingly, Russell's edge in consistency is perhaps a little bit of another factor that went towards him having a pretty dominant and uneventful race out front, because I think that actually the pace difference between Mercedes, McLaren and Red Bull, or Verstappen's Red Bull, even though Verstappen was having balance problems, was incredibly close. We see then Norris trailing slightly behind, Piastri even less consistent, similar to Hamilton, and then Gasly was your least consistent driver. And if we look at tyre wear, we'll start with the medium tyres. That's what most drivers started on. Verstappen didn't. He started on a soft, which was suboptimal given he didn't make up the track position. Anyway, what this chart shows are the fuel-adjusted lap times. So this aims to show the change in lap time throughout the driver's stint, given the effect of fuel wear being negated. So what we can see here is just how much extra pace Russell had. Of course, his line sits lower. That means his lap times were lower. He was incredibly quick, but it's the steepness of the line that shows you how quickly the tyres are wearing. Russell's line is much more steep than the line of the two McLarens. We see Norris here is this non-dotted orange line, and Piastri is the dotted one. And we see that actually as the stint goes on towards here, sort of about lap 21, we get this crossover point where actually Russell becomes slower than the McLarens. Why? Because his tyres are wearing a lot faster. Leclerc and his Ferrari actually had similar tyre wear to Russell, although of course he was off the pace, which is why the line sits higher. And my main takeaway from this is that McLaren haven't lost their tyre wear advantage. Perhaps we've been lulled into thinking so because recent tracks have been lower deg, but Singapore, which is slightly harder on the tyres, did show that. When we look at the hard tyre though, which is of course quite a bit more durable, we see tyre wear become very similar. In fact, if we look at these drivers again, it's only really Leclerc that stands out as having worse tyre wear. The rest of them are pretty comparable. And we see that actually Verstappen had a lot of pace on these tyres, but his wear was incredibly similar to both McLaren and Mercedes. And just to take a look at the overall strategy on this race, we see of course Verstappen stands out with his opening soft stint. Norris and Piastri here run their mediums slightly later, benefiting from better wear. And of course down here we have Carlos Sainz, who somehow managed to take his medium set of tyres all the way to lap 50, which ended up getting him in the points. Another big story of this race were Max Verstappen's struggles, and actually Verstappen and Russell had very similar fastest laps, so we can compare them for a good bit of insight. We see that it's incredibly tight. Russell has a share, when you look at the mini sectors, of being quicker in 55% of the lap compared to Verstappen's 44%, and this is what it looks like when you break it down. We can see quite clearly he complained about braking issues, and we can see that here. Russell is on average braking later, but also the peak deceleration that Russell is experiencing is higher. He is just more confident on his brakes. It's very clear Max Verstappen was having issues. We see if we analyse each corner, Russell has braked later at every single one around the lap. Now we can analyse this even further by looking at the cornering performance, and actually in high-speed corners Verstappen is quicker. Of course Singapore is not a high-speed dominated track, but this is still interesting to see. Of course Verstappen and Red Bull had that new floor in Monza, and that's been helping them at other tracks, but it is still working here, so it will still work for the rest of the season most likely. Interestingly though, low-speed corners Russell has an advantage, and that is very indicative of Max Verstappen having poor mechanical balance, as you really rely on the mechanical grip through the low-speed corners, whereas you're relying on the aero grip through the high-speed corners. And another note on this is that Verstappen complaining about downshifts likely has something to do with his braking struggles. Of course, he was complaining about bad braking stability, and downshifts, of course, as you go down through the gears, cause engine braking, and the rear brakes on F1 cars are actually electronically controlled to carefully mix the ERS regen, the actual braking, and also the engine braking, very closely related to downshifts, all into one. So it's no surprise he was asking his engineers for settings advice. Now, while there weren't a whole load of individual incidents to analyse, we did of course have that Lewis Hamilton brake failure, and here, just looking at lap 57, I think we can already start to see that he might have been having some issues. This is comparing his braking trace with Verstappen, and we see already he's braking earlier and holding the brakes longer, even though he was on that nice soft tyre set. If we then move this all the way up to lap 61, we see how bad his issues really were. You can see him here into turn 12 actually pretty much pumping the brake pedal to try and get the car slowed down, coming on and off the brakes, probably trying to manage overheating of his other calipers, as well as that front left, which failed pretty catastrophically, as we saw. We can also see how he doesn't dare go near 100% throttle, and to be honest, I don't think you can blame him, but here, of course, many sections, Verstappen is still driving as usual on full throttle. Hamilton, brakes not working, and that is why he lost so much time. Of course, he then did end up getting a 5-second penalty for cutting the track. And finally then, for a quick look at pit stops, we had Norris and McLaren getting the fastest stop, but it wasn't the same for both the McLaren drivers. We see down here, Piastri losing over 3 seconds to that Norris stop. Overall though, we had Mercedes being the fastest team in the pits, on average 6% quicker than the other teams. And here's the distribution of all of their pit stops. Anyway, that's all the analysis I have for you in this video. I think it really goes to show just how close of a race that was. And in my opinion, if any of the McLarens or Verstappen or of course Russell started on pole, they would have had a very high chance of winning this one. And this bodes really well for the rest of the season, but it will be interesting to see if that McLaren Tyre Wear advantage starts to crop up a bit more at some other tracks. But that's all, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.